18,000 feet over the English Channel. November 1940. A Royal Air Force Spitfire has a Messerschmitt Bf 109 dead to rights in the gun sight. The kill is inevitable, but the German pilot knows a secret. He doesn't brake left or right. Instead, he slams the flight stick forward, entering a violent negative G bunt. The British pilot follows, pushing his nose down to track the kill. But before he can fire, the roar of the 1,000 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin is replaced by a sickening silence. The engine coughs, spits black smoke, and cuts out completely. The propeller windmills helplessly against the slipstream. The German fighter, powered by a superior fuel-injected Daimler-Benz, screams away untouched. The British pilot is left drifting in the sky, a sitting duck, betrayed by his own machine. To understand how the RAF fixed this fatal flaw with a 50-cent piece of brass, we have to look inside the engine itself. The heart of the Spitfire, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. It was a watchmaker's instrument built on a massive scale, 27 liters of displacement, 12 cylinders singing in perfect harmony to produce over 1,000 horsepower. In level flight or a climbing turn, it was superior to anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. But like many aristocratic things, the Merlin was temperamental, and its Achilles heel was hidden inside a component that hadn't changed much since the First World War. The Skinner's Union, SU carburetor. To understand the betrayal, you have to visualize the mechanics of breath. The SU carburetor worked on a principle of elegant simplicity, designed primarily for fuel efficiency and smooth cruising, vital traits for an island nation that needed its fighters to patrol for hours. Inside the carburetor was a float chamber, functioning almost exactly like the tank on a household toilet. A brass float sat on top of a pool of fuel. As the engine drank the fuel, the level dropped, the float lowered, and a needle valve opened to let more fuel in. When the chamber was full, the float rose and sealed the valve. It was a perfect system, as long as gravity pointed down. But aerial combat is a rebellion against gravity. When a German pilot in a Messerschmitt Bf 109 pushed his stick forward to dive a maneuver known as a bunt, he induced negative G-force. For a split second, the pilot would feel himself lift out of his seat, straining against his harness. Inside the Spitfire's engine, the laws of physics wreaked havoc. Under negative G, the fuel in the float chamber didn't stay at the bottom. It became weightless and surged to the top of the chamber. Simultaneously, the heavy brass float, no longer supported by the buoyancy of the fuel, crashed down to the floor of the chamber. This triggered the mechanical catastrophe. The dropped float told the needle valve that the chamber was empty, throwing the valve wide open. The fuel pump, dutifully doing its job, forced a massive, pressurized stream of aviation spirit into an already chaotic chamber. The result wasn't fuel starvation, as is often commonly believed. It was the opposite. The engine didn't starve, it drowned. The fuel-air mixture, usually a precise mist, instantly turned into a solid slug of liquid gasoline. This phenomenon, known technically as a rich cut, flooded the supercharger. The mixture became too rich to burn. The spark plugs, suddenly soaked in raw fuel, failed to fire. In the cockpit, the violence of this failure was terrifying. One moment, the Merlin was roaring. The next, a harsh, spluttering silence, followed by a plume of black, unburnt fuel smoke belching from the exhaust stacks. The aircraft would shudder as the propeller acted as a giant air brake, instantly robbing the pilot of speed and energy. Across the channel, the Germans did not have this problem. The Daimler-Benz DB 601 engine, powering the Bf 109, used direct fuel injection. It was a brute force, complex system that discarded the delicate float chamber entirely. Instead, high-pressure pumps sprayed fuel directly into the cylinder's combustion chambers. It didn't matter if the German plane was upside down, spinning, or pulling negative 3 Gs, the engine simply kept running. It was a Predator's engine, indifferent to physics. This technical disparity created a tactical nightmare for the Royal Air Force. The German pilots, realizing the British weakness, developed a specific escape maneuver. If a Spitfire got on their tail, they would simply push the nose down hard. The Bf 109 would dive instantly, its engine screaming without a hiccup. The British pilot, seeing this, faced an impossible choice. If he pushed the stick forward to follow, his engine would cut out, and he would be left drifting while the German escaped, or, worse, circled back to kill him. To maintain pursuit, the RAF pilot had to perform a clumsy workaround. He had to roll his Spitfire upside down, inverting the plane to maintain positive Gs relative to the airframe, and then pull back on the stick to dive. It was a maneuver that took 2 to 3 seconds to execute. In the high-speed geometry of a dogfight, 3 seconds is an eternity. By the time the Spitfire had rolled and dived, the Messerschmitt was 500 yards away and accelerating. The British pilots were flying the most beautiful aircraft ever built, but they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. They weren't losing dogfights because they lacked skill. They were losing because their engines were designed for gentlemanly patrols, while the enemies were designed for the chaotic violence of total war. The frustration in the mess halls was palpable. Squadron commanders filed furious reports. Mechanics tinkered endlessly with mixtures. But the fundamental design flaw remained. The Air Ministry's official solution was a complete redesign, a pressure carburetor that would mimic the German capability. But engineering a new fuel system for mass production takes years. The blueprints for the pressure carburetor wouldn't be ready for the assembly line until 1943. It was late 1940. France had fallen. The Blitz was incinerating London. The RAF couldn't wait 3 years for a perfect solution. They needed a fix today. They needed someone who wasn't looking for an engineering masterpiece, but a way to cheat the physics that were killing their friends. They needed a racer. That racer was Beatrice Schilling, though everyone at the Royal Aircraft Establishment simply called her Tilly. If you walked into the RAE at Farnborough in 1940 expecting to find a polite, tea-sipping academic, you would be gravely mistaken. Schilling was a force of nature in a leather jacket. A woman who didn't just study thermodynamics on a chalkboard, she lived at the Red Line. Before the war, Schilling hadn't spent her weekends at garden parties. She spent them tearing around the steeply banked concrete of the Brooklands racing circuit on a modified Norton M30 motorcycle she affectionately named Old Man. She wasn't just fast, she was historically fast. In an era when 100 miles per hour was considered a terrifying speed for an automobile, Schilling had clocked a lap at 106 miles per hour on 2 wheels. She was one of only 3 people in history to earn the gold star for that feat, and the only woman. She knew what it felt like when an engine screamed for mercy. She knew that under the extreme stress of competition, delicate theories fell apart and only brute mechanical truths survived. While the senior engineers at Rolls-Royce were paralyzed by the complexity of designing the perfect pressure carburetor, a massive project that involved intricate diaphragms, new pumps, and a complete replumbing of the Merlin engine, Schilling approached the problem with the ruthless pragmatism of a pit crew mechanic. She looked at the float chamber reports and saw the physics of the failure not as a complex fluid dynamics puzzle, but as a simple plumbing issue. The Rolls-Royce team was trying to stop the fuel from moving during negative Gs. Schilling realized that was the wrong goal. You couldn't stop gravity. The fuel was going to rise. The float was going to drop. The needle valve was going to open. That was inevitable physics. The problem wasn't the opening of the valve, it was the volume of the catastrophe that followed. When that valve opened wide, the fuel pump dumped everything it had into the engine, drowning it instantly. Her heretical question was simple. What if we just didn't let the pump do that? She didn't need a new engine. She just needed a dam. Schilling calculated that at full throttle, the Merlin engine demanded a specific, maximum amount of fuel. Any flow rate above that was unnecessary. If she placed a physical barrier in the fuel line, a literal bottleneck, she could cap the maximum flow. Under normal flight, the fuel would flow through the restriction smoothly, feeding the engine exactly what it needed. But when the pilot pushed into a negative G dive and the needle valve threw itself wide open, the fuel pump would try to surge a tidal wave of gasoline into the chamber. Instead of flooding the engine, that tidal wave would slam into Schilling's barrier. The fuel would still flow, but only at the maximum calculated rate. It wouldn't be enough to drown the supercharger. The solution wasn't a multi-million-pound redesign. It was a small brass thimble, later simplified to a flat washer, with a precisely calibrated hole drilled in the center. It looked like something you could buy at a hardware store for pennies. But the geometry of that hole was the result of rigorous mathematical calculation and bench testing. Make it too small, and the Spitfire would starve at full power, turning a high-speed pursuit into a deadly glide. Make it too big, and the engine would still flood during the bunt. She called it the RAE, restrictor. It was a masterclass in stupid engineering. It didn't fix the float chamber. It didn't fix the needle valve. Technically, the carburetor still malfunctioned during every dive, but the restrictor made the malfunction survivable. It turned a catastrophic engine failure into a momentary hesitation. But in the rigid hierarchy of the British military establishment, proposing that the answer to the Luftwaffe's technological supremacy was a metal washer with a hole in it was borderline insulting. The Air Ministry wanted a proper engineering solution from Rolls-Royce, fully documented and tested over months. They wanted the pressure carburetor. Schilling held up a piece of brass that could be installed in 5 minutes and said, "This stops the engines from dying." Today, she wasn't interested in the perfect solution for 1943. She was interested in keeping Flight Lieutenant Davies and his squadron alive for the morning patrol. And to do that, she would have to bypass the polite way of doing things and get her hands dirty on the flight line. But getting her hands dirty on the flight line was the easy part. Navigating the labyrinth of the Air Ministry was the true war of attrition. To the career bureaucrats and senior procurement officers in London, Schilling's solution was anathema. It violated the cardinal rule of British engineering: perfectionism. When Schilling presented the RAE restrictor, the response from the establishment wasn't applause. It was skepticism bordering on disdain. To the men at the ministry, this wasn't an upgrade. It was a bodge, a crude temporary patch job that admitted the Merlin engine, the pride of the Royal Air Force, was fundamentally flawed. They looked at her simple brass washer and saw a liability. They worried about fuel starvation at high altitudes. They worried about lean mixtures overheating the cylinder heads. They worried about the paperwork. The conflict wasn't born of malice, but of a dangerous disconnect between the drawing board and the dogfight. The Air Ministry was fixated on the correct solution, the pressure carburetor, and they were technically right. A pressure carburetor, which used diaphragms instead of floats to regulate fuel, was the superior engineering answer. It would completely eliminate the negative G cutout without compromising maximum power. But the correct solution was a logistical leviathan. Converting the production lines at the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby to manufacture pressure carburetors would require new tooling, new casting molds, and a halt in engine delivery. In the winter of 1940, with the Luftwaffe still pounding British cities and Fighter Command barely recovering from the Battle of Britain, pausing production was suicide. The timeline for the pressure carburetor was 18 months, maybe 2 years. Schilling countered with a timeline of her own, right now. She argued that while the Air Ministry waited for the perfect component, the RAF was losing seasoned pilots to a preventable physics problem. Every time a squadron leader had to break off an attack because his engine coughed, the Luftwaffe learned that the British were vulnerable. The enemy was becoming bolder, baiting RAF fighters into diving traps, knowing the Merlin would choke. The friction came to a head not in a boardroom, but through the undeniable brutal mathematics of attrition. As the RAF shifted from the defensive stance of the Battle of Britain to the offensive circus and rhubarb sweeps over France, the problem intensified. Over English soil, a momentary engine cutout was frightening. Over occupied France, it was a death sentence. A stalled engine meant losing energy, losing altitude, and becoming a slow-moving target for flak or enemy fighters. Faced with mounting combat reports detailing engine failure during evasive maneuvers, the resistance at the ministry finally cracked. They couldn't give the pilots the new carburetor, so they had to give them the washer. But approval was only the first hurdle. The logistical challenge was staggering. The RAF didn't need 10 restrictors for a test. They needed thousands. They needed to retrofit every operational Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command, from the squadrons stationed at Biggin Hill to the coastal patrols in Scotland. And they had to do it without grounding the Air Force. This was where Schilling's genius for simplicity outmaneuvered the bureaucracy. Had she designed a complex valve or a new fuel pump, the retrofit would have required taking aircraft out of service for days. But the restrictor was designed to fit inside the existing geometry of the Merlin engine. Specifically, it fit inside the banjo union, a hollow bolt shaped like a musical banjo that connected the fuel line to the carburetor. Because the restrictor was nothing more than a small brass disc, it could be retrofitted in the field by a standard mechanic with a standard toolkit. No welding torches, no engine hoists, no factory returns. A mechanic simply had to unscrew the banjo bolt, drop the washer into the fuel line like a coin into a slot, and screw the bolt back on. The Air Ministry issued the modification order. It wasn't a glorious rollout. There were no press releases celebrating the 50-cent washer. It was a quiet, frantic mobilization of ground crews working in freezing hangars, undoing bolts, inserting brass, and hoping that this tiny obstruction would do what the best engineers in the world said was impossible. Schilling traveled from base to base, her motorcycle saddlebags often filled with the brass prototypes, overseeing the installations herself. She wasn't just an engineer anymore. She was an evangelist for the dirty hack. She had to convince skeptical flight sergeants men who had spent their lives tuning these engines that deliberately blocking the fuel line was a good idea. By March 1941, the modification was spreading through fighter command like a virus. The perfect solution was still years away, locked in the drafting rooms of Derby. But the imperfect solution was now sitting in the fuel lines of the frontline fighters, waiting for the next scramble. The theory was sound. The bench tests were successful. But bench tests don't shoot back. The true validation would only come at 20,000 feet, in the split second when a pilot decided to bet his life on Beatrice Schilling's math. That bet was placed on a freezing tarmac at RAF Biggin Hill, under the watchful eye of a leading aircraftman named Cooper. There was no dramatic music, no welding torch hissing in the pre-dawn light, and certainly no unauthorized tampering. The installation of the RAE restrictor was an operation of almost insulting simplicity. Cooper simply took a wrench to the fuel line of the Hawker Hurricane, specifically targeting the banjo union, the critical junction where the fuel line fed into the carburetor. He loosened the bolt, the smell of high-octane aviation spirit filling the cold air. With the bolt removed, he took the small brass disc Schilling had provided, a wafer of metal no larger than a farthing, and dropped it into the hollow of the union. He tightened the bolt back down. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. There were no new pumps, no rewired circuits, no complex pressure diaphragms. Just a washer sitting invisibly inside the plumbing. To the pilot walking out to the aircraft, Flight Lieutenant James Jasper Davies, the plane looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But hidden inside the aluminum skin, the fuel system had been fundamentally lobotomized. It was no longer capable of flooding itself. Davies climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and fired the starter cartridge. The Merlin, the 12th engine, coughed once, then roared to life, the propeller blurring into a translucent disc. On the ground, the engine sounded identical. The restrictor didn't affect the idle. It didn't affect the takeoff power. Its job was to wait for chaos. The section of 3 Hurricanes clawed for altitude, climbing through the gray overcast to patrol the coast near Dungeness. At 18,000 feet, the air was thin and cold. Davies scanned the horizon, his eyes straining against the glare. The patrol seemed routine until the radio crackled with the vector from the ground controller. Bandits, Angels 1 to 8, south of the Cape. 2 minutes later, Davies saw them, a pair of Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, flying fast and low against the cloud deck, heading back toward France. This was the moment the trap was sprung. In previous months, this geometry would have been a stalemate. The Germans were below him. To engage, Davies would have to dive. The German pilots, spotting the Hurricanes, reacted with the arrogance of men who trusted their machines completely. They didn't bank or turn to fight. They simply pushed their sticks forward, entering a steep, negative G dive toward the safety of the channel. It was the standard Luftwaffe escape clause. They knew the British planes couldn't follow without their engines choking. Davies's training screamed at him to roll the aircraft to invert the Hurricane so he could pull positive Gs into the dive and keep the carburetor happy. It was a reflex born of survival. But that roll would cost him 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the 109 seconds would be out of range. Davies didn't roll. He gritted his teeth, braced his stomach muscles against the harness, and shoved the control column violently forward. The nose of the Hurricane dropped like a stone. The negative G-force hit him instantly, lifting him out of his seat, the straps digging into his shoulders. Dust and loose debris from the cockpit floor floated up past his face. Inside the engine cowling, the laws of physics executed their inevitable sequence. The fuel in the float chamber levitated, and the heavy brass float crashed down, throwing the needle valve wide open. The fuel pump, sensing the open line, surged to maximum pressure, trying to force a lethal dose of gasoline into the supercharger. But this time, the surge hit a wall. The fuel slammed into Beatrice Schilling's brass washer. The tiny, calibrated orifice 0.04 inches in diameter refused to accept the tidal wave. It metered the flow, allowing only the precise amount of fuel the engine could consume at maximum power, and not a drop more. Davies waited for the silence. He waited for the sickening lurch of the propeller acting as an air brake. He waited for the black smoke. It never came. The Merlin engine missed a single beat, a momentary, barely perceptible hesitation, and then kept screaming at full power. The rich cut had been decapitated. The Hurricane accelerated into the dive, its nose locked onto the fleeing Messerschmitt. The German pilot must have checked his mirror, expecting to see the British fighter faltering, falling behind as its engine died. Instead, he saw the terrifying shape of a Hurricane growing larger by the second, its propeller spinning a solid arc of vengeance. The escape maneuver had failed. The immunity was gone. Davies closed the distance to 200 yards. The vibration of the engine at full dive speed rattled his teeth, but the power delivery was smooth, continuous, unrelenting. He lined up the deflection shot and squeezed the trigger. 8 Browning. 303 machine guns erupted, sawing through the Messerschmitt's wing root. The German fighter snapped right, trailing smoke, and disintegrated before it hit the water. Davies pulled back on the stick, the G-forces reversing from negative to heavy positive, crushing him back into his seat as the Hurricane soared back toward the sun. He checked his gauges. Oil pressure normal. Coolant temperature normal. The engine was singing. When the flight landed back at Biggin Hill, the ground crew was waiting. They didn't need to ask. The pilots weren't climbing out with the haunted look of men who had been defenseless. They were energized. Davies walked over to Cooper, the heat of the engine still ticking as the metal cooled. He didn't offer a complex technical debrief. He simply patted the cowling of the Hurricane right over the fuel line and said, "Whatever you put in there, put it in the rest of them." Now, the test was over. The theory was fact. The RAE restrictor wasn't just a washer. It was a permission slip for aggression. The British pilots no longer had to fly politely. They could fly like predators. And across the channel, the Luftwaffe was about to discover that the rules of the game had just changed. The rules of the game had changed, and the Luftwaffe was the first to notice the discrepancy. In the weeks following the rollout at Biggin Hill, German intelligence officers began debriefing shaken pilots returning from the Channel front. Their reports contained a disturbing anomaly. The British Spitfires were no longer breaking off during high-speed dives. The bunt escape maneuver, once a guaranteed ticket to safety, was now a trap. German pilots who shoved their sticks forward, expecting to leave the RAF sputtering in their wake, were finding with terrifying consistency that the British were glued to their tails, engines roaring, guns firing all the way down to the deck. The tactical advantage had shifted overnight. The Schilling solution transformed the Spitfire from a defensive interceptor, tethered to the concept of home defense, into a ruthless offensive hunter. With the restrictor installed, RAF pilots could aggressively pursue enemy fighters during the Rhubarb Sweep's freelance low-level sorties over occupied France, designed to harass German infrastructure. Confidence in the cockpit soared. A pilot who trusts his engine flies differently than one who fears it. The hesitation that cost those vital 2 or 3 seconds, the mental calculus of, "Will it quit on me?" evaporated. Back on the ground, the gratitude of the Royal Air Force took a uniquely British and characteristically irreverent form. As the brass washers were distributed by the thousands to every squadron in fighter command, a nickname began to circulate in the mess halls. It started with Sir Stanley Hooker, the chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, and spread rapidly through the ranks of 20-year-old pilots fueled by adrenaline and gallows humor. They didn't call it the RAE restrictor. They christened it Miss Schilling's Orifice. To a modern ear, the name might sound like crude disrespect, a misogynistic jab at the woman who had intruded into their male sanctum. But in the context of 1,941, amongst men who lived with the daily specter of violent death, it was the highest form of endearment. In the RAF, you didn't get a nickname unless you were accepted. You didn't get teased unless you were family. Beatrice Schilling wasn't offended. She drove her Norton motorcycle to the bases, walked into the hangars, and faced the jokes with the stoic cool of a racer. She understood the dark humor of combat. She knew that by naming the device after her, they were acknowledging that she had saved their lives. She had become a legend in the mess, the girl from Farnborough, who knew more about fluid dynamics than the Air Ministry and more about courage than the bureaucrats. The vindication of her dirty hack was absolute. By the summer of 1941, the kill-to-loss ratios began to climb. The restrictor didn't win the war on its own radar. tactics, and bravery did that, but it removed the single greatest mechanical handicap facing fighter command. It bought the British engineering industry time. While the factories in Derby slowly retooled to produce the complex pressure carburetors that would eventually arrive in 1943, Schilling's washer held the line. For 2 critical years, the stopgap was the standard. It proved that in the existential struggle of total war, the best solution is often the enemy of the good enough solution. The Air Ministry had wanted perfection and delivered delays. Schilling had offered a patch and delivered air superiority. The Luftwaffe never regained the initiative in the engine war. By the time the Focke-Wulf 190 appeared, the Merlin engines had evolved, but the psychological blow had been struck. The German pilots learned to fear the silhouette of a Spitfire in their mirror, knowing that no matter how hard they dove, the British machine would follow them into the abyss, screaming defiance through a tiny brass hole. But the tiny brass hole was never intended to be permanent. It was a bridge across a technological chasm. By 1943, the massive industrial wheels of Rolls-Royce had finally turned. The factory in Derby began rolling out the Merlin 61 series. Equipped with the Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburetor, the correct engineering solution that the Air Ministry had promised back in 1940. This new system used complex diaphragms to force-feed fuel into the supercharger, completely eliminating the need for a float chamber and rendering the negative G problem a memory. Yet, to dismiss Beatrice Schilling's invention as merely a temporary fix misses the deeper, more brilliant truth of British aerial strategy. For decades, historians have asked why the Royal Air Force stubbornly clung to the obsolete Skinner's Union carburetor when the Germans clearly had superior fuel injection technology. The common narrative is that British engineering was simply behind the times. The reality is far more calculated. The RAF didn't stick with the carburetor because they were stupid. They stuck with it because they were defending an island. The SU carburetor, despite its acrobatic flaws, was a miracle of efficiency. It atomized fuel into a finer mist than the early German injection systems, creating a cleaner burn at low throttle settings. This gave the Spitfire a lower, specific fuel consumption during cruise. In the Battle of Britain, this efficiency was a strategic superweapon. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 flying from France had only about 80 minutes of fuel. By the time it crossed the Channel and reached London, the German pilot had 10 minutes of combat time before his red light flashed, forcing him to flee or swim. The Spitfire, sipping fuel through its primitive carburetor, could loiter on patrol for hours, waiting to pounce. If the British had rushed to copy the German injection system in 1939, they might have gained acrobatic performance, but they would have sacrificed the range and loiter time that allowed them to keep a constant shield over southern England. Beatrice Schilling's genius was that she allowed the RAF to have it both ways. Her restrictor neutralized the combat disadvantage of the carburetor without sacrificing the fuel efficiency that was winning the strategic war. She didn't just fix a broken part, she saved a doctrine. Schilling remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment for the rest of her career, never losing her appetite for speed or her disdain for unnecessary complexity. While her male colleagues climbed the ladder into administrative roles, pushing paper behind desks, Tilly stayed in the lab and on the track. In the 1,950 seconds, as the roar of piston engines gave way to the shriek of jets, she turned her attention to the Blue Streak ballistic missile program and the terrified physics of runway friction for heavy bombers. But her most characteristic post-war contribution wasn't a weapon. It was a bobsled. When the Royal Air Force Olympic bobsled team faced unexplained stability issues, they didn't call a sports coach, they called Schilling. She approached the sled exactly as she had the Merlin engine. Not as a mystical art, but as a math problem involving friction, drag, and gravity. She redesigned their sleds, stripping away the superstition and replacing it with aerodynamics. It was the same pattern. Identify the invisible force that is slowing you down, and engineer a way to cheat it. She retired in 1969, not to a rocking chair, but to her garage. She continued to race her beloved Norton motorcycles well into her 70s, tuning the engines herself, her hands permanently stained with oil and grease. When she died in 1990, the obituaries listed her titles: Officer of the Order of the British Empire, Doctor of Science, Senior Principal Scientific Officer. But the pilots who flew in 1941 remembered her differently. They didn't care about the letters after her name. They remembered the feeling of diving into the gun sight of a fleeing enemy, bracing for the silence that usually killed them, and hearing instead the defiant, unbroken roar of 1,000 horsepower. They remembered the woman who bought them the most precious commodity in war: time. Sometimes, the history of warfare isn't written by the generals who move armies on a map, or the industrialists who build the fleets. Sometimes, it's written by a racer who looks at a multi-million-dollar problem, pulls a 50-cent washer out of her pocket, and says, "I can fix that." Beatrice Schilling's fix was more than just a mechanical solution. It was a vindication of a specific philosophy of warfare. Throughout World War II, the Axis powers were often seduced by the allure of Wunderwaffen wonder weapons. They built tanks like the Tiger that were engineering marvels but nightmares to maintain, and jet engines that were decades ahead of their time but flamed out after 10 hours of flight. They chased the horizon of technological perfection. The Allies, driven by engineers like Schilling, chased the reality of the battlefield. They understood that a weapon that works 90% of the time, available today, is infinitely superior to a weapon that works 100% of the time, but arrives tomorrow. The RAE, restrictor, was the ultimate embodiment of this hacker mindset. It was ugly, it was simple, and it was technically a compromise. But it turned the Spitfire into a machine that could finally match the aggression of its pilots. It reminds us that innovation isn't always about adding complexity. Often, it's about stripping a problem down to its raw physics and finding the path of least resistance. Schilling looked at a drowning engine and didn't see a need for a new design. She saw a need for a dam. In doing so, she saved 2,100 pilots, not by rewriting the laws of aerodynamics, but by respecting the brutal simplicity of gravity. If you believe that these are the stories that deserve to be told, the stories of the mavericks, the racers, and the mechanics who worked in the shadows to keep the propellers turning, then you are in the right place. We are building an archive of military history that looks beyond the generals and the maps to find the dirty hacks that actually won the war. Help us keep these engines running. Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a briefing. If this deep dive gave you a new respect for the Spitfire and the woman who saved it, hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm that real engineering history matters. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What is another example of a stupid military fix that saved lives? Let's get the discussion started down below. Beatrice Schilling solved the problem of the stalling engine, allowing the RAF to push their aircraft to the limit. But as the war dragged on and horsepower increased, pilots began to encounter a new, invisible enemy. As they dove from high altitudes, approaching the speed of sound, the air itself seemed to turn solid. Controls locked up, yokes froze. Planes disintegrated in mid-air, hammered by shockwaves that no one understood. The next barrier wasn't mechanical, it was sonic. And while the Spitfire ruled the channel, in the Pacific, a twin-boomed American monster was about to run headfirst into this physics demon. Next time, we're going to uncover the terrifying story of the P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed devil, and the compressibility crisis that threatened to ground the U.S. Army Air Force. I'll see you in the skies.